Growing up, I learned very early that in my family, love came with a scoreboard. Not a literal one hanging on the wall, of course, but it might as well have been there, glowing above the dinner table every night. Invisible points were constantly being awarded, and my sister, Lila, was always far ahead. I could practically hear the numbers ticking upward every time she spoke, every time she walked into a room, every time she breathed in a way that somehow impressed my parents more than anything I ever did. Lila was 2 years older than me, and according to my parents, she was the gold standard for everything a daughter should be. She had perfect grades, perfect hair that never seemed to frizz even on humid days, perfect posture, and perfect manners that made adults smile approvingly. Teachers adored her. Relatives praised her. Even strangers seemed to like her immediately. My mother often described her as a natural success, the kind of phrase that sounded like it belonged in a magazine article about prodigies. And then there was me. If Lila was the shining trophy on the shelf, I was the dusty object behind it that nobody really noticed. "Why can't you be more like Lila?" was the sentence that followed me through childhood, like a shadow. I heard it in the kitchen while doing homework. I heard it during car rides home from school. I heard it whispered during family gatherings when relatives thought I couldn't hear. At first, I believed them. When I was 8 years old, Lila brought home a math test with a bright red 100 written at the top. My parents celebrated like she had just won an Olympic medal. My dad ordered pizza that night, and my mom told everyone on the phone about Lila's brilliant mind. A week later, I brought home a 92 on my own test. I remember placing the paper carefully on the table, hoping maybe this time things would feel similar. My dad looked at it, nodded once, and said, "That's good. But Lila usually gets 100. That moment stuck with me longer than the grade itself. It was my first real lesson in the family scoreboard. If Lila cleaned the kitchen once, she was praised as such a responsible young woman. And if I cleaned it every day for a week, it was simply expected. If Lila helped our mom cook dinner, everyone talked about how caring she was. If I helped, my mother would just say, "Make sure you don't burn the rice." Even when we were teenagers, the comparisons never stopped. They just became more public. Family gatherings were the worst. Every holiday dinner felt like a performance review where I was the disappointing employee. Relatives would gather around the table while my parents proudly updated everyone on Lila's latest achievements. "Oh, Lila just got accepted into another honors program," my mom would announce with a glowing smile. Then her eyes would shift toward me. "And Emma, well, she's figuring things out." That phrase became my label, figuring things out. It sounded harmless to anyone listening, but I knew what it really meant. It meant unfinished. It meant behind. It meant not good enough yet. The truth was, I wasn't failing. I just wasn't walking the same path as my sister. While Lila loved structured things like exams, business classes, and leadership clubs, I loved building things that didn't fit into neat categories. I spent hours online teaching myself graphic design. I watched tutorials about web development late at night. I experimented with fonts, colors, layouts, and digital tools that most of my classmates had never even heard of. Creating things made me feel alive in a way textbooks never did. But none of that came with medals or report cards my parents understood. Meanwhile, Lila was thriving in the exact system my parents admired. She studied business administration at a prestigious university and graduated with honors. Every step of her journey became a family headline. When she got her first internship, my father raised a glass at dinner and said, "This is just the beginning. Our future CEO." Everyone clapped. I clapped too. Not because I believed it, but because by then I had learned that silence was easier than arguing. During those same years, I had started freelancing online. At first, it was small projects, designing logos for startups, building simple websites, creating social media branding for small businesses. My first payment was $80. I remember staring at the screen, shocked that someone had paid me for something I created. That $80 slowly became hundreds, then thousands. But when I tried explaining this to my parents, the conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. "You make logos on the computer, right?" my mom asked. "Well, It's more like digital branding and that's nice, she interrupted. But you should think about a real career too. A real career. That phrase stung more than I expected. So eventually, I stopped explaining. Every time I tried to talk about clients, marketing strategies, or online platforms, someone changed the subject back to Lila's achievements. If they didn't care enough to understand, I didn't care enough to convince them. Instead, I focused on building quietly. While my family compared diplomas and corporate titles, I was learning skills they didn't even know existed. I studied branding psychology, user experience design, online marketing funnels, and global freelance platforms. I stayed up until 3 in the morning working with clients in different time zones. By the time I was 24, my small freelance work had turned into something much bigger. I had built a digital branding business, not a hobby, a real business. I worked with startup founders, influencers, and small companies that wanted to build their online presence. Most of my clients weren't even in the same country as me. My laptop had become my office, my passport, and my opportunity all at once. But at family dinners, none of that existed. To them, I was still the daughter figuring things out. Meanwhile, Lila graduated and landed a corporate job almost immediately. My parents treated it like the final confirmation that their predictions had been right all along. Lila has stability, my father said once during dinner while pointing his fork at me. You should learn from her. I nodded silently and kept eating. What he didn't know was that I had already earned more money that month than Lila would make in 3. But saying that out loud would have started a war. So I stayed quiet. Not because they were right, but because I knew something they didn't. The scoreboard they had been watching my entire life wasn't the real one. And one day, whether they liked it or not, they were going to see the difference. The dinner started like every other family gathering in our house, loud, crowded, and full of the kind of polite tension that only families who compare each other too much can create. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic filled the kitchen, plates clattered against the counter, and my mom moved around the room with the nervous energy of someone hosting a very important event. Because to her, this dinner was for Lila. Specifically, it was to celebrate her recent promotion at work. She had been promoted from junior analyst to team lead after only a year at the company, and my parents had been talking about it for weeks like it was a historic achievement. My dad had even called relatives to make sure they came. Success should be celebrated properly, he had said on the phone a few days earlier. When I arrived at the house, the driveway was already packed with cars. Through the living room window, I could see my aunt and uncle sitting on the couch while my cousins scrolled through their phones. I stood in the car for a moment before getting out. Family dinners had always felt like stepping into a familiar script. Everyone had their roles, their lines, their expectations, and I already knew mine. I walked inside and forced a smile. Hi, everyone. My aunt waved from the couch. Emma. It's been so long. Before I could respond, my mom appeared from the kitchen and immediately grabbed my arm, pulling me aside like she had something urgent to discuss. Try to look happy tonight, she whispered. I blinked. I am happy. This dinner is about your sister, she added, lowering her voice even more, as if that wasn't already obvious. I know. She studied my face for a second, like she was checking for signs of jealousy or resentment. Then she nodded and rushed back toward the kitchen. I exhaled slowly. Same dinner. Same script. When everyone finally gathered around the dining table, it looked like a small family banquet. My mom had gone all out. Roasted chicken, rice, vegetables, fresh bread, and a cake waiting on the counter for later. Lila sat near the center of the table, like the guest of honor. She looked happy, but slightly embarrassed by all the attention. My dad stood up halfway through dinner, holding a glass of wine. That's when I knew the speech was coming. He cleared his throat. I just want to say how proud we are of Lila, he began, his voice loud enough to command the entire table. Everyone stopped eating. She has always been hardworking, disciplined, and focused, he continued. Everything she's achieved is the result of dedication and determination. My mom nodded enthusiastically beside him. She's always been like this, she added proudly. Lila smiled politely, looking down at her plate. She didn't become successful by accident, my dad said. She earned it. Everyone clapped lightly. I clapped too, though my hands felt mechanical. This part of the night was expected, but what came next was even more predictable. My aunt leaned back in her chair and looked across the table at me with a friendly smile. "So, Emma," she asked, "what are you doing these days?" The question itself wasn't bad, but in our family, it always carried a second meaning. Comparison time. I opened my mouth to answer, but my mom spoke first. "She does some design work on the computer," she said casually. Some design work on the computer. 3 words that somehow managed to shrink my entire career into something that sounded like a teenager's hobby. My cousin Ryan smirked slightly. "Freelance stuff?" he asked. I nodded. Yeah. It was technically true, but the way it sounded in the room made it feel small. My dad leaned back in his chair and sighed loudly. "You know," he said, looking around the table, "this is exactly what we've always tried to explain to Emma." My stomach tightened. Here it comes. "Lila worked hard, followed a clear path, and now she's successful," he continued. "Emma could have done the same thing if she applied herself." The table went quiet. A few relatives exchanged awkward glances, but no one interrupted. My face grew warm, but not in the way it used to when I was younger. Back then, these comments would make me shrink into my chair, embarrassed and defensive. Now, the feeling was different. It felt like exhaustion. 25 years of the same comparison. 25 years of hearing how I could be better if I were more like someone else. Lila shifted slightly in her seat. She looked uncomfortable, but she didn't say anything. My dad continued eating, clearly satisfied with his point. Then he added the sentence that finally pushed something inside me past its limit. "It's just frustrating seeing how different the results are when you compare the two." Compare the two. The words hung in the air like a challenge. I looked down at my plate for a moment. Part of me wanted to ignore it, like I always had. Smile politely. Change the subject. Let the night pass. But something inside me had changed over the years. Silence wasn't protecting anyone anymore. It was just continuing the pattern. So I slowly set my fork down on the table. The small clink of metal against the plate sounded louder than it should have. "You're right," I said calmly. Several heads turned toward me. My dad raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" I leaned back slightly in my chair. "Yes," I continued. "Let's compare." The room went completely still. My mom immediately looked nervous. "Emma," she said quickly, "this isn't necessary." But I shook my head. "No, it is." Because for most of my life, they had controlled the comparison. They chose the subjects, grades, degrees, corporate titles. They had spent decades measuring me against Lila using a ruler that only worked in her favor. But tonight, for the first time, I realized something important. The scoreboard they had been using wasn't the only one that existed. My dad folded his arms. "What exactly do you mean?" he asked. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. "If we're going to compare our careers," I said calmly, "we should probably use actual numbers." My cousin leaned forward slightly. "What numbers?" I unlocked my phone and opened an app. The soft glow of the screen reflected on the table. "Lila works at a great company," I continued. "Her salary is about $55,000 a year, right?" Lila looked surprised, but nodded slowly. "Yeah, around that." My father frowned. "Where is this going?" I glanced up at him. For the first time in my life, I wasn't nervous during one of these conversations, because for once, I wasn't defending myself. I was just telling the truth. And something told me that the comparison they loved so much was about to become very uncomfortable. For a few seconds after my last sentence, no one said anything. The glow of my phone screen lit up my hands while the rest of the table seemed frozen in place. Forks hovered above plates. Someone cleared their throat quietly. The air felt thick, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. My dad leaned forward slightly, his eyebrows pulled together in confusion. "Where is this going?" he asked again. I looked at him, then at Lila. She didn't look angry, mostly just confused and curious. I took a slow breath. You said it's frustrating when you compare the results between us, I said calmly. So I thought we should compare them properly. My mom shifted in her chair. Emma, really, this dinner is supposed to be celebratory. It still is, I said gently, nodding toward Lila. She earned her promotion. That's great. Lila gave me a small, uncertain smile. But if we're going to talk about careers, I continued, then we should probably talk about the full picture. My cousin Ryan leaned forward on his elbows, clearly entertained now. Okay, he said. I'm curious. I glanced down at my phone again and tapped the screen. Lila works at a great company, I said. Her salary is around $55,000 a year, right? Lila hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. Yeah, roughly. My dad crossed his arms. And that's a solid salary, I said, especially early in a career. My aunt nodded approvingly. Exactly. I lifted my eyes from the screen and looked around the table. My business revenue last year was $312,000. Silence. Not the polite pause from earlier. This time it was complete, absolute silence. My cousin Ryan blinked twice. Wait, he said slowly. What? My aunt leaned forward. Did you say 300,000? Yes. My mom stared at me like I had just spoken a foreign language. That can't be right. I turned the phone slightly so the screen faced the table. The dashboard was open. Graphs, invoices, monthly revenue summaries. Numbers filled the screen. They were very real numbers. Ryan let out a quiet whistle. Holy! My dad leaned closer, squinting at the screen. That must be total over several years, he said quickly. No, I replied. Last year. The table went quiet again. My uncle adjusted his glasses. From logos? I almost laughed. No, I said. From branding strategy, web design, digital marketing consultation, and long-term contracts with companies. They all stared at me. For years, I had tried explaining this. Tonight was apparently the first time anyone was actually listening. I scrolled slightly and showed another section. I have clients in 6 countries, I continued. 2 tech startups in California, a marketing agency in London, an online education company in Australia, and a few others. My aunt looked stunned. You work with companies overseas? Most of my clients are overseas. My mom shook her head slowly. But you just work from your laptop? Yes. The disbelief on their faces almost made the moment surreal. For years, they had treated my career like a small side hobby. Now they were staring at the evidence like it had appeared out of nowhere. My dad leaned back in his chair. That doesn't make sense, he muttered. I kept my voice calm. It makes sense if you understand the industry. No one replied. Because none of them did. Lila was still staring at the screen. Finally, she looked up at me. You never told us it was this big. I raised an eyebrow slightly. I tried. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Because she remembered. They all did. Every time I tried explaining what I did, the conversation had lasted about 30 seconds before someone changed the subject. I locked my phone and placed it on the table. You've always compared us, I said quietly. No one interrupted this time. So I figured we should do a fair comparison. My dad rubbed his forehead. This doesn't sound stable, he said finally. There it was. The classic argument. But it is, I replied. Freelance work can disappear overnight. It could, I agreed. Then I shrugged slightly. But I've had consistent clients for 4 years, and half my income comes from long-term contracts. Ryan leaned back in his chair. So you're basically running a company. I am running a company. My aunt blinked slowly. 300,000, she whispered again. But I wasn't finished yet. There was one more piece of information they didn't know. I picked up my phone again and opened another file. Oh, I said casually. And I just bought a house. Every single person at the table froze. My mom's fork dropped onto her plate with a sharp clatter. You what? Last month. Ryan laughed in disbelief. No way. My dad stared at me. You're joking. I turned to the screen again and showed them the photo. A small modern house. Nothing massive or extravagant, but bright, clean, and mine. The purchase documents were underneath the image. My aunt covered her mouth. You bought property? Yes. With your business money? Yes. My mom looked completely stunned. But you never said anything. I leaned back slightly. When would I have? No one had an answer. Because the truth was obvious. Every time I tried to talk about my life, the conversation eventually turned back to Lila. My cousin Ryan shook his head. Okay, hold on, he said. Let me get this straight. He pointed between me and Lila. So Lila has the corporate career everyone talks about. Lila looked slightly uncomfortable. And Emma secretly runs an international business and just bought a house? That's about right, I said. The silence that followed felt different from before. Earlier, it had been awkward. Now it was heavy. My dad stared at the table like he was trying to process years of assumptions all at once. My mom looked at me in a way she never had before, like she was seeing a stranger, or maybe seeing me clearly for the first time. Finally, my aunt spoke. Why didn't you tell us? I smiled faintly. I did. No one argued. Because they knew I was right. The truth was simple. For years, they had asked me to be more like Lila, but they had never once stopped to ask who I actually was. And now, suddenly, the comparison they loved so much didn't feel very comfortable anymore. Dinner ended much earlier than anyone had planned. The cake my mom had proudly placed on the counter never even got cut. Plates sat half-finished on the table, glasses of wine untouched, and conversations that had been loud and cheerful earlier now turned into quiet murmurs and awkward goodbyes. One by one, relatives began standing up. My aunt hugged my mom and said something softly that I couldn't hear. My uncle shook my dad's hand and glanced at me with an expression that looked like a mixture of shock and curiosity. My cousin Ryan gave me a look that said he was definitely going to be texting his friends about this later. Within 20 minutes, the house that had been full of chatter was almost empty. The silence that replaced it felt strange. My mom moved around the kitchen slowly, stacking plates with stiff, distracted movements. My dad stood near the window with his arms crossed, staring outside into the dark like he was trying to solve a difficult puzzle. Lila sat at the table, quietly tracing circles on the tablecloth with her finger. No one seemed to know what to say first. I helped carry a few dishes into the kitchen, rinsing them under the sink while my mom stood beside me. Finally, she spoke. Why didn't you tell us? Her voice sounded softer than usual, but there was something fragile inside it. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands. I did, I said gently. She looked at me. You never said it was that big. I leaned against the counter. I tried to explain my work a few times, I replied. But every time I started talking about it, someone changed the subject. She opened her mouth, then paused, because she knew it was true. There had been dozens of moments like that over the years, me trying to explain a new client, a project I was proud of, a milestone I had reached. And every time, the conversation drifted back to Lila's exams, Lila's internships, Lila's promotions. My mom exhaled slowly and looked down at the dishes in the sink. I thought freelancing was just temporary, she admitted. For a while it was, I said. My dad finally turned around from the window. You should have told us you were making that kind of money. I couldn't help letting out a quiet laugh. You wouldn't have believed me. He didn't respond. Because deep down, he knew that was true too. For years, my parents had built a very specific picture in their minds of what success looked like. It involved degrees, office buildings, job titles, promotions, and steady paychecks. My path had none of those things. So they had simply assumed it wasn't real. Lila finally pushed her chair back and stood up. I'm going to head home, she said quietly. My mom looked surprised. But the cake? I'll take a slice tomorrow, Lila replied with a small smile. She grabbed her purse and walked toward the door. As she passed me, she paused briefly. Can we talk sometime? She asked. Of course. She nodded and left. The door closed softly behind her. After that, the house became even quieter. My dad eventually returned to the table and sat down slowly, like the weight of the evening had suddenly settled on his shoulders. I didn't realize, he said. I didn't ask what exactly he meant. Because I knew. He hadn't realized I had built a life outside the one he imagined for me. He hadn't realized that the daughter he thought was figuring things out had already figured out quite a lot. The next few weeks were strange. Not bad, just different. The comparison stopped. Completely. No more comments about how I should follow Lila's example. No more subtle lectures about stability or responsibility. Instead, something unexpected happened. My parents started asking questions, real questions. One evening, my mom sat down beside me on the couch. "How did you start the business?" she asked. Another time, my dad looked over my shoulder while I worked on my laptop. "How do you even find clients in other countries?" Their curiosity felt genuine, but it also felt surreal. For years, they had dismissed everything I did. Now they were trying to understand it. It was like they had suddenly discovered a part of my life they didn't know existed. The biggest surprise, though, came from Lila. About 2 weeks after the dinner, she texted me, "Coffee tomorrow?" Just us. We met at a small cafe downtown. Lila was already there when I arrived, sitting near the window with 2 cups on the table. She slid one toward me as I sat down. "Thanks for coming," she said. "Of course." For a moment, we just stirred our coffee in silence. Then she looked up. "I need to tell you something." Her voice sounded nervous. "Okay," I said. She took a deep breath. "I hated the comparisons too." I blinked. "What?" She let out a small laugh, though it didn't sound very amused. "Everyone always thought I loved being the perfect one," she said. "But it was exhausting." I frowned slightly. "Exhausting how?" She leaned back in her chair. "Because once you become the example, you can't mess up." I hadn't thought about it that way before. "If I got a 95 instead of a 100, Mom would ask what went wrong," she continued. "If I struggled in a class, Dad would panic like my entire future was collapsing." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. I felt like if I ever failed, I'd disappoint everyone. The realization settled slowly in my mind. All those years, I had seen her as the one who had everything easier, but maybe her pressure had just been different. "Meanwhile," she said with a small smile, "you were quietly building an empire." I laughed softly. "I wouldn't call it an empire. 300,000 a year sounds pretty empire-like to me." We both laughed then. The tension between us felt lighter than it had in years. Then she looked at me again, more seriously this time. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm proud of you." The words hit me harder than I expected, not because I needed her approval, but because it was the first time our relationship felt like it wasn't built on comparison. For the first time in our lives, we weren't competing. We were just sisters. The strange thing about the night of that dinner was that it didn't explode the way I once imagined it might. For years, whenever my parents compared me to Lila, a part of me fantasized about proving them wrong in some dramatic way. In those daydreams, I would stand up, reveal everything I had accomplished, and the room would fall silent while everyone suddenly realized how badly they had underestimated me. Reality was quieter than that. No dramatic apologies, no emotional speeches, just a long silence that forced everyone to think. In the weeks after the dinner, life slowly returned to normal, but the dynamic in our family had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. The comparison stopped. Not gradually. Completely. No more comments about how I should follow Lila's example. No more subtle reminders about stability or responsibility or real careers. The sentence, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" disappeared from the house as if someone had erased it from existence. At first, I kept waiting for it to return. Old habits and families usually don't disappear overnight, but it didn't. Instead, something unexpected replaced it. Curiosity. My parents began asking questions they had never asked before. Real ones. One afternoon, I was working from the dining table with my laptop open when my dad walked by and paused behind me. He stood there for a moment, watching the screen. "What exactly are you designing?" he asked. I turned slightly so he could see. A website layout for a startup in Toronto. He leaned closer. They're paying you for this? Yes. He nodded slowly, clearly trying to understand the scale of something that had once seemed invisible to him. Another day, my mom sat beside me on the couch while I was reviewing client messages. How do people even find you? She asked. Mostly referrals, I explained. When one company likes my work, they recommend me to others. She frowned thoughtfully. So it grows on its own? Pretty much. She looked impressed in a way I had never seen before. It wasn't overwhelming praise like the kind Lila used to receive growing up, but it was something better. Respect. The biggest shift happened during another family gathering about a month later. We were sitting around the same dining table when my aunt asked the familiar question. So how is work going for both of you? For a split second, the old tension returned, but this time, my dad answered first. Both of my daughters are doing very well, he said calmly. He gestured toward Lila. She's leading a team at her company. Then he nodded toward me. And Emma runs her own international business. He said it so naturally. No comparison. No hierarchy. Just two different accomplishments. That simple sentence changed something inside me. For the first time in my life, I felt like my parents weren't measuring me against someone else. They were simply acknowledging who I was. Lila's life changed too. Not immediately, but gradually. After our coffee conversation, we started talking more often. Without the pressure of constant comparison, our relationship became something it had never truly been before. Normal. We started sharing ideas, frustrations, and even jokes about the strange expectations we had grown up with. About 6 months after that dinner, she called me one evening. I think I'm going to leave my job, she said. I nearly dropped my phone. What? She laughed nervously. I've been thinking about it for a while. I like the work, but I don't love the structure. What are you going to do instead? I want to start consulting, she said. Business strategy for startups. I smiled. That sounds perfect for you. She hesitated. There's one problem, though. What? I have no idea how to build a brand for myself. I couldn't help laughing. You called the right person. A few weeks later, we were sitting together at my desk while I worked on her new company logo and website. Watching her excitement as the project came together reminded me of the nights I had spent years earlier learning design by myself, except now I wasn't alone. We worked side by side for hours, throwing around ideas, debating colors, and building something that belonged entirely to her. At one point, she leaned back in the chair and looked at the screen. I can't believe we're doing this, she said. What part? That you're helping me start a business. I shrugged. Why wouldn't I? She smiled. Because for most of our lives, everyone acted like we were supposed to compete. I looked at the screen for a moment. The irony wasn't lost on me. Our parents had spent years comparing us, assuming that one path was better than the other. But in the end, the paths had led us right back to each other. Different strengths, different skills, but surprisingly compatible ones. And the truth was, I had never wanted to prove that I was better than Lila. That had never been the goal. All I had ever wanted was the chance to be seen without being measured against someone else. The funny thing about comparisons is that they only work when everyone agrees on the rules. For years, my family had compared grades, degrees, and job titles. Those were the categories they understood. But the world had changed. Success didn't belong to just one path anymore. It could be built online, across borders, through creativity, technology, and ideas that didn't fit inside traditional boxes. And once that reality entered the room, the old scoreboard stopped making sense. Looking back, I don't think the comparison at that dinner destroyed my family. It just forced them to see something they had ignored for years. That two people can grow up in the same house and succeed in completely different ways. And neither path needs to be smaller for the other to matter. Sometimes the only way to stop a comparison is to finish it.